Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. You'll also find our archives where you can listen to every episode we've ever done going back to 2006. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is October 15th, 2015, and before introducing today's guest, I want to mention that over at our website, econtalk.org, Amy Willis of the Library of Economics and Liberty, which is our host, she has started posting what we call extras. Essentially, they're blog posts with provocative questions to encourage follow-up conversation and learning related to each episode. A lot of you asked for that in our surveys, so I encourage you to check those out and follow me on Twitter at EconTalker, 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 to find out more, and I usually mention when they get posted. Now for today's guest. He is Cesar Hidalgo. He is director of the Macro Connections Group at the MIT Media Lab, and he's an associate professor of media arts and sciences at MIT, and the author of Why Information Grows, The Evolution of Order, From Atoms to Economies. Cesar, welcome to EconTalk.
It's my pleasure to be here.
So let's start with the basics. You mean something very specific by information that's not necessarily the everyday use of the word. So why don't you explain what information is to you?
Yeah, so when people think about the word information, usually they think about messages, and they think sometimes even about the meaning of those messages. So one of the things that I do in my book is, in the beginning, I'm very clear about what I mean by information, which is not messages, it's not the meaning of the messages, but it's the physical order that we use to transmit messages, but also to transmit the practical uses of knowledge and know-how in products. So I take a very general definition of information that involves all forms of physical order, where that order is embodied in a brand new car, in a strand of DNA, or in a sequence of words in a book.
And you're a physicist originally by training.
Yep.
And you embed this conversation and analysis of information in a physical context. And you start with entropy, which is not going to be our main focus, but I found it fascinating. It's always intrigued me. Entropy is supposed to be increasing in the universe, and yet in the aftermath of the Big Bang and everything's very hot, then things start to get cold, and you'd think things would kind of die out and we just have an empty universe with nothing in it. But as you point out, and as scientists have wondered about for a while, the Earth is a pocket, a small corner of the universe where it appears we have, at times, we reverse entropy. So talk about the physics of that for a minute and how the best way to understand how that reversal happens.
Yeah, so to understand information from a physical perspective, one thing that is very important and that has been emphasized by a lot of scientists before me is the fact that information always needs to be physically embodied. Okay? So when you think about information from a physical perspective, you're thinking about the different states or configurations that a particle or a molecule can take. For instance, if you would talk to a very modern quantum physicist, when he would be describing or she would be describing a collision between a couple of particles, it would not be so much about like the exchange of momentum or energy, but the exchange of information that is embodied in those states. Okay? And so the first thing that we need to understand there is that information is always physically embodied. Now, the thing is there are many different ways in which information can be physically embodied because, physics actually has like a great diversity of ways in which you can store order. Some of the ways in which sometimes that sequences or that type of order is embodied is in thermal states. These are just like random fluctuations that exist in any body that is at non-zero temperature. And the problem of those thermal states, that even though there are many, actually most of these states are just, based on these fluctuations, is that you cannot then extract that information. You cannot use it for anything useful, because in some way, these are states in which everything has already averaged out. So the information that we have in the universe that is useful for us is the information that is not necessarily embodied just on these thermal states, but is the information that is embodied on things that are highly ordered, that are actually the opposite of that, which would be like information that is embodied on a strand of DNA or on a molecule of sugar, which is something that is not random and that eventually we can make use of. So the universe has a natural tendency to take systems that are highly organized and eventually average them out and put them in a state in which, most configurations are equally likely and there's not that much order.
You give the example. You give the example in the book of you put some dye into a liquid. It starts off in one little place. It starts making little patterns, and then eventually it disperses throughout the liquid and in that average level that's not very interesting.
Exactly. So putting milk in coffee is another example that I think most listeners would be familiar with. When you put milk in coffee, at the beginning you have like a beautiful dollop, you have a beautiful swirl, but after a while it's just a hazy cloud in which the particles of milk are mixed with the particles of coffee and water, and there's no structure anymore. So the thing is, how do we get to live in a planet in which there's so much structure if the universe has a tendency to make a structure disappear? And in the beginning of the book, I explain the tricks that the universe has to allow information to exist and to grow despite this tendency that the universe has to be hostile to order. And the tricks are the existence of systems in which you have flows of energy. So this is the work of Ilya Prigozhin that help us understand that information is not free and order is not free. You need to spend energy to produce it. There's a cost. The other ingredient that you need is you need to have ways of saving information, and that's what solids are good for. The DNA in your body does not need to recreate the information that it has embodied in it all the time because it's very stable to thermal fluctuations, so it can store information for long periods of time. And finally, these two things combine to generate systems like biological cells or humans or societies that embody the capacity to compute. That is, that they can use energy to actually beget new information out of old information by recombining it, by copying it, by duplicating it, and so forth.
In the case of the Earth, the ongoing energy from the sun is a key part of that story. And of course, for our daily lives, it's our, as you call it at one point, it's our software that we have in our bodies, which is our brain, which allows us to increase order, even though the natural tendency is chaos or disorder.
So in some way, you can think that a lot of what the book is about like the struggle between developing computational systems that are able to create information, whether these are cells, humans, or economies, and how these computational systems exploit energy to create sequences of information that they can use in the future. And this could be, proteins that they use in the operation of a cell. They could be text that we use to communicate among humans. They could be objects like the telephone that I'm using to communicate with you nowadays. And these objects are solid, they're stable to thermal fluctuations, and therefore we can use them to communicate and to help this collective computer keep on functioning because, we don't need to spend energy to keep on creating them all the time. So we have in a more economic language, like a savings rate that is allowed by the universe by existing at a range of temperatures in which we can create objects that are stable to thermal fluctuations.
So before we get into some of the more economic applications of this, I just want to read a short paragraph that I just enjoyed a great deal. And if you want to comment on it, you can. I'm not quite sure. I don't remember why you told the story, but it's such a nice story, so I'm gonna read it. It's about the birth of your wife, the birth of your daughter, when your wife gave birth to your daughter, Iris, and
okay.
Your wife is Anna. So sorry about all that mess up. Here's the quote. It took only 26 minutes for Anna to push Iris into the hands of the nervous but focused medical student who received her. 26 minutes sounds like a short time for delivery, and it is. Yet I will argue that the trip that Iris made that night was not a 26-minute trip down a few inches of birth canal, but a 100,000-year journey from a distant past to an alien future. In 26 minutes, Iris traveled from the ancientness of her mother's womb to the modernity of 21st century society. Birth is, in essence, time travel. Why'd you mention that? I don't remember, actually. Do you remember? I'm sorry to surprise you with this.
No, absolutely, because that in some ways is the opening story of the book, and it helps illustrate one of the main points of the book, which is when we think about the development of our society or our economy, in some way, what we're looking at is the development of changes in the way in which we have ordered a fixed set of atoms that we have in the world. The difference between the civilization that we have now and the civilization that existed in our planet 100,000 years ago is not in the atoms that exist in our planet, because those are conserved. People 100,000 years ago also had access to energy. If you think about it, the sun was obviously there, and there were fossil fuels that they didn't know how to exploit, but they were available as well. So what has actually changed, in these 100,000 years is the way in which we have arranged those atoms to create a world that allows us to live at a much higher standard of living. But what's interesting about the way that we arrange atoms, unlike other species, is that we arrange atoms by first figuring out configurations of atoms that are useful through mental processes, and then embodying that imagination into objects. So, for instance, if you think of a world that is populated only by ants have a very fixed vocabulary that they can use to communicate that is based on pheromones and that is encoded in their genes. But we have a vocabulary that is ever expanding because we're able to crystallize imagination that comes of our brains. So when my daughter was born that day, what happened is that she encountered a world in which the light that was filling up that room that night was coming from fluorescent and incandescent light bulbs that were imagined by people before they were constructed. The music that filled up the room was music that was being played by a tablet computer that was actually running an algorithm that would recommend songs for us and would play them for us. So she was born in a world that was very different from the one in which our species evolved, in big part because our species what has done, and what the economy, in my interpretation, is this ability to transform information into reality. So this story, I think, helps illustrate powerfully the idea that what makes our society prosperous, is not financial measures that are, I would say, more short-term interpretation of what the economy is, but the ability that we have had as a species to create imaginary objects in tangible forms that are useful and that allow us to access capacities that would be not otherwise possible to access without this ability to embody imagination into tangible objects.
And you talk about this in different ways, and it made me think about it as well, which is that it's not just that we have all these clever ways to use information. We preserve them, and so you emphasize a lot our connections to each other at a point in time, but I kept thinking about it, and as you talk about it now, I think about our ability to stand on the shoulders of giants. People have come before us who've thought of things, and we don't lose those. That's really what's extraordinary. You talk about it some, but I think that part of the human condition is we don't appreciate it. We obviously understand that there are many things in our lives that we enjoy that we don't understand, that we don't know how they work. But the idea that insight and what you called crystallized information, the creativity of past human beings can still be enjoyed by us today is really a rather remarkable thing.
Absolutely. So I'm probably guessing here, but you might have heard of the work of Robert Boyd, the cultural anthropologist.
No.
He actually has a bunch of great books. You might consider inviting him to your program, and some of these books are called Not by Genes Alone. And what he talks a lot about is this idea of cumulative culture, which is the fact that as a species, one of the things that makes us successful is that we're able to accumulate volumes of knowledge and information that are much larger than any individual could by distributing that accumulation in a society and by being able to perform that accumulation of knowledge and information through generations. So one story that he sometimes used to motivate that idea is he makes the observation that when people from England tried to cross, the Arctic and died, there were people that were relatively sophisticated, for their time. There were 19th century explorers, that were coming out from the most developed country in the world, but they died in an environment in which people that were quote unquote more primitive, like the Inuits, were able to survive for thousands of years. And the question is why? And Boyd's answer to that is that, well, the Inuits had an enormous amount of knowledge of how to survive in such environment. Okay? And that knowledge had been accumulated over many generations. It was very hard to codify. And therefore, the Englishmen that tried to cross, the Arctic, in that expedition, were unsuccessful at doing so because they didn't know how to do it, and it would have been hard for them to acquire the knowledge of how to do that. Simply, because that knowledge is cumulative, it develops over a large amount of generations, and it's accumulated at a collective level, which make it very hard to transfer, but at the same time very crucial for you to be able to survive in that environment, or in our modern world, to create, things that are relatively complex.
Well, the other thought I had is that we are able to do that relatively easily, partly because we can read books, obviously, but as your example points out, the Inuit they didn't write books. If they had, reading them probably would have helped the English. That wasn't exactly the problem, because a lot of it was, as you describe in your book, tacit knowledge. It wasn't necessarily things you can write down. It's things you come to embody and feel and understand without being able to totally explain them. Some of that comes from imitation. Some of it comes from trial and error. It comes from a lot of different ways. But I suspect a lot of the ways that we are able to access the information of the past is through the technology and the machines of the past that we take and just improve. We don't think of it as part of our inheritance, but of course it is. So cars get better and better. Nobody has to figure out from scratch how to make a car, because it's not like the last generation ends and we say, tell us what you learned about cars so we can make one. It's this ongoing overlapping process that the knowledge gets preserved through communication as well as the devices that are already there.
Absolutely. So knowledge is one of those words that in some way can only be properly understood if you make some distinctions. And one distinction that is very important, as you mentioned, is the one between tacit and explicit knowledge. Tacit knowledge is the one that Michael Jordan had when he was playing, basketball in the 1990s. And I think here we could both agree that we could have talked with Michael Jordan for days, hours, months, or years, and we would have never been able to develop his capacity to put a ball inside a hoop.
Yeah, it's easy.
Yeah, exactly. He can tell you just like shoot it, in this angle, that's how you stand. But at the same time, you have that tacit knowledge that is embodied in individuals, and sometimes there's tacit knowledge that is embodied in teams. Sports is a great example of that, because sometimes you see teams in which the players might individually not be that great, but they play collectively in such a coordinated way that they know exactly when another player is walking behind them, so they can give them the pass, or they can, fool the defensive maneuvers of the adversary team, that they are embodying knowledge, at a collective level. And that is very much true in firms. Even I see it in my group at MIT or in my startup, in which we develop these complex software projects that are these large data visualization engines. And by now we have a relatively well-defined division of knowledge, in which I know that there's some guys that know about backend, some guys that know about front-end, some guys that know about design, and that it would be very hard for me to reaccumulate that knowledge, or even to transfer the knowledge to other people without adding them slowly to the group, which is the only way in which I'm able to expand the number of people that have that capacity, simply because there's tacit knowledge that is also embodied in groups of people. And firms are a great way for society to embody that tacit knowledge, because they're made of overlapping generations in which people pass on some practices that can be codified, but many of which that cannot be codified.
So in the 90s, I think it was the 90s, there was a big fad, at least I think it was a fad in management education, about trying to utilize the knowledge that was in a firm that was greater than the knowledge of any individual person in it, or to think about how to maintain the knowledge when there was turnover. So if you were to leave the lab, you have lots of knowledge, not just of your own insights and expertise. You have a huge amount of tacit knowledge about the capabilities of the people in the lab, their strengths, their weaknesses, that also really can't be written down and can't really be preserved. I think it's unique to the team and its constituents at any one time.
Exactly. So, and that's a little bit of the theme of the book, which is, well, how do we get to accumulate these vast amounts of knowledge? And the idea is that we are able to accumulate this vast amount of knowledge, because we have tricks that allow us to transcend our finite capacity to do that as units. So if you think about the world, 3 billion years ago, okay, which is kind of like a time scale that is a little bit longer than the one that economists usually like to think about, but there was just a planet here, and it was exactly, and it was populated by mostly unicellular organisms, and at that time, type of things that those unicellular organisms could achieve were relatively primitive for today's standards. Okay? And the thing is that those unicellular organisms had a finite capacity to compute, because any system that is finite in amount of matter and energy that they're able to embody, is going to be finite in its capacity to compute too. There are like actually physical laws that tell you, given the amount of matter and the amount of energy available to a system, how much computation that system can complete. But that finiteness was not the end of the growth of order or information in our planet. At some point, those unicellular organisms figured out how to become multicellular, and those multicellular organisms were able to accumulate amounts of knowledge that were much larger than the one of the unicellular organisms could ever achieve. By the same token, as humans, we are also finite in our capacity to accumulate knowledge and know-how. Actually, each one of us knows very few things, and when you talk to a person that comes from a different field, it's very easy to find areas of knowledge that you might know and that a person don't, and vice versa. We know very few things. And the way that we transcend our finite capacity to accumulate knowledge is by accumulating that knowledge collectively. So the fact that knowledge has to be embodied in units that are of finite capacity is what allows us to accumulate knowledge and know-how and eventually to beget information, but it's also what makes it difficult, because it transformed the problem of knowledge accumulation to a problem of network creation. If you're not able to sustain the networks that allow you to accumulate knowledge, you are going to eventually be stuck with a ceiling. There's at some point that you're not going to be able to accumulate any more information simply because, you have reached the capacity of the units.
Yeah, why don't you talk, before we go on, about the distinction between knowledge and know-how, which you mentioned in passing.
Yeah. So knowledge and know-how is the language that I use to describe more succinctly the difference between explicit knowledge and tacit knowledge. So I use the word knowledge to refer to the knowledge that can be codified, the one that can be expressed in books or the one that we can talk about. Know-how is the shorthand that I use to talk about tacit knowledge, which is the knowledge that is embodied, on an expert violinist that might be able to tell you something about how to play the violin, but when push comes to shove, that's a type of knowledge that can only be accumulated by practicing in the right context, the activity that you want to do. And many of that knowledge sometimes cannot be codified at all. And there are a lot of simple examples of that. For instance, you know how to see, but you probably don't know how you see, because if you knew how you see, you should be able to create like some very sophisticated computer vision algorithms that would match, what humans are able to do when processing visual input. So the words knowledge and know-how, I use them to refer to tacit knowledge and to explicit knowledge. Know-how being the definition of tacit knowledge, and knowledge being the one that I use for explicit knowledge.
So let's take the next leap. As you say, a lot of what we need to do then as human beings, we need to work with, we need to cooperate, we need to work with other people, we need to leverage not just the information of others, not just the knowledge of others, not just the know-how of others, but we need to interact with that. It's very complicated, obviously, and your book spends a lot of time trying to get at that. So what are the keys, as you see them, in making those networks possible?
Yeah. So in that context, what I like about thinking of societies and economies in terms of computation is that by understanding that computation needs to be embodied in networks, we can start quickly incorporating ideas of institutions into our understanding of economies in a very natural way. Because at the end of the day, institutions help us shape the ability that we have to connect with one another. One institution, for instance, that people in the social capital literature have focused a lot on is the idea of trust. Okay? In a society in which you would have high levels of trust, and people would not be very skeptical about one another, and they wouldn't think that they're going to very easily betray them, they're going to be able to have a larger number of interactions because each one of these interactions has a lower cost. And this is going to allow them to create larger networks that can accumulate a larger computational capacity. In a society that the levels of trust are relatively low, you are going to have a society in which people can have very few links because each link is very expensive. And consequently, they're going to be able to accumulate a relatively small computational capacity. So trust is one of these institutions, but obviously there are many others. There are changes in sometimes transportation and communication technologies that change the cost of interactions. There could be also some formal institutions, some certain laws, insurance schemes that can help us reduce the transaction costs that we have between people, or reduce the risks of performing certain type of transactions that also help us catalyze the formation of these networks. So that's, in summary, like how the networks would help us incorporate the idea of institutions, and how by incorporating institutions into networks, we can explain how societies with different institutions have different computational capacities.
We'll get to that in a sec, but I want to challenge something I didn't see in the book and get your reaction. So you don't make much of a distinction between innovation and production, or creation and production. So when I think of a small firm, or a large firm even, there's a small number of people. They work together, they interact in all kinds of inexplicable and hard to quantify ways, but a great firm, a really innovative company, is doing exactly what you're talking about. They're people who come to trust one another, they share ideas, they stimulate each other's thinking, and they come up with fabulous products and fabulous ideas. But the production of those products is a different challenge. It also involves networking. So because we don't specialize, right? Typically, there's not vertical integration of a product. So a company, as you mentioned, like Apple, will produce its products all over the world. Different pieces come from all kinds of different places. It's not just the know-how, though, that comes from different places, or the knowledge. It's also the physical need to produce those in different places. And you didn't talk about much about that, or do you think of that as just part of the whole process?
So I agree that the links that you have with people to invent something, or to scale the distribution of something that you have invented already, are quite different. The links that you would use to invent something tend to be more intimate. They have to be much stronger. They have to have a high level of trust, because people need to actually challenge each other and in ways that would allow them to do those creative activities. But at some point, when the product that is being made has been figured out, you can scale that through a different type of network in which you might have a lot of repeated type of knowledge and know-how. For instance, you can have like a large sales team in which many people more or less know about the same, but you need a large number of them, not because you're accumulating vast amount of knowledge, but simply because you're trying to have connections to a larger number of people in the context of a commercial operation.
The world's a big place.
Exactly. Or by the same token, when you are manufacturing a product that you already have figured out, how to manufacture, or how it looks like, you have already designed it. To scale that manufacturing, you're going to need to include more people that are doing exactly the same as other people, in that firm. So I do think that there's a strong distinction between the creative links that you use to invent. I like to think of invention as very different from innovation, because invention is when you create something new. Innovation is when you improve something that already exists. And then the links that you would use to scale a certain operation, like the ones that you would use to bring manufacturing to scale, or to have a big sales effort by having a large sales team.
I guess the other thought I had is that I'm sort of challenging the social network part of this, at least for the creation of knowledge and creation of know-how. It's usually a small group of people who create a new product. They do rely on immense numbers of people who've come before them. But that kind of knowledge that they're using is often passed on in the form of books, in the form of teaching, in the form of going to graduate school, or other ways. You don't have to trust those people. That knowledge is just, you can grab that. The really hard part of the people is the knowledge that's created through the face-to-face interactions, and that's a relatively small network, it seems to me.
Yeah, exactly. It's a relatively small network, but it's a crucial network because it's the one that recombines all of that codified knowledge and then transform it into something new. But at the same time, the capacity of people to have intimate connections is quite finite, just because of obvious time constraints. If you think about it, how many people you can actually have a meaningful meeting on a given day? Maybe 6-8 meetings a day, and you're super tired at the end of the day. So despite the fact that those networks are relatively small, they eat most of the bandwidth of an entrepreneur. If the entrepreneur is focusing on participating on the creative process. So the fact that we can codify knowledge and we can transmit it sometimes through books, sometimes through education, and sometimes through objects, because the guys that I build software with, they don't build the hardware that we use to embody our software, but they access, the knowledge, not the knowledge needed to create the hardware, but the practical uses of the knowledge that went into create of the hardware through those objects. So I wouldn't see like any contradiction. The fact that the networks are small, I don't see it as something that would in some way contradict what we have been talking about before, but rather that the capacity that we have to create, meaningful networks in which we can be creative is quite finite. Because we have like important constraints that come from the amount of time that we have, the speed at which we communicate with one another, and the length that it takes to form a meaningful relationship with another person, which is also something that is not easy.
I guess I brought it up because I think about Adam Smith, and I think about growth from the levels that of say 1,500, 1,400, 50, 80, 120 years in the Common Era. We had a very flat time, and then we had an enormous explosion over the last 200, 250. And a lot of that comes through, I would suggest, non-planned, undesigned cooperation. The social trust, a lot of that is face-to-face, and it's planned. It's a group of people get together in the modern world to do something. But a lot of our cooperation, I suspect, that's important takes place mitigated through the price system that's not intended. It just emerges as supply chains and other forms.
Yeah, so I think, and here I'll challenge you back, okay? If that's
Go
okay.
ahead. Yeah,
so,
that's the goal.
Because in some way, I understand that it's very attractive to think of a world in which everybody more or less is driven by self-interest, left to their own devices. They buy inputs through the price system, they recombine them, and they sell a certain output, that also goes into a market through the price system. And it's attractive, from, I think, a standard economic theory perspective to think of the world that way. But most people, for a fact, they don't work by themselves. So first of all of these units that are getting inputs in and they're producing outputs, they tend to already be collaborative. And they, even a bakery might have, a couple of bakers. They might have, someone that is sitting at the register. If you have a larger operation like a car manufacturing plant, they might buy inputs and they might sell, outputs. But internally, those networks need to exist. So on the one hand, the fact that you have a market doesn't preclude that you have other instances in which you need to have a more intimate and form of collaboration that is not driven by prices. That's a little bit of what motivated Ronald Coase to come up with his theory. In my book, I talk about like Coase, about Coase's theory of the firm, in which, Coase in the 1930s, goes to a presentation from a professor in the Department of Commerce in LSE. And this professor says, well, the normal economic system works itself out. And Coase, as he said in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, thought that was total bullshit because he saw that in reality the world was made of a lot of islands of conscious power that were firms, that work in some form of, centralized planning in which the price system was not playing such an important role. The price system played a role between firms, but within the firms, there are important hierarchies or there are important networks that are formed that have to make decisions not based on the supply and demand that is signaled by price systems, but based on more social mechanisms that might involve the knowledge that each person has about the capacities of someone else, the way that they will react to other things, and ultimately those units are fundamental because if you would destroy each one of the firms and we would go back to an economy in which everybody would be by themselves, just getting inputs and trying to produce output, I'm pretty sure that our economy would be probably less sophisticated than that in the Mad Max movies, in which people are more or less by themselves in the desert. So the price system, I agree that it helps reveal information about the supply and demand of things, but there's much more to the economy than that. It's not just about making commercial transactions. What makes an economy work at the end is that we figure out things that are worth transacting. And that's a part of the economy that I haven't seen that much explained in their theories, in which the things that get produced more or less are assumed to be there because they're either widgets or they're, some sort of object that that we assume that is there, and the focus has been most on the commercial transactions among those things that exist, rather than on the interactions that have to happen among people to bring things into existence.
Well, first of all, I think you're right as a general criticism of at least textbook economics. It is one of the stranger, especially the theory of the firm, it is one of the stranger aspects of the way we teach economics, that the biggest decision a firm has to make is how much to produce, which is the last thing in the real world that firms worry about. It's not in the real world. Firms have to figure out what market they want to be in. Whereas in the textbook, they take the market they're in is given, they take the prices given often. But in the real world, they have to figure out what market they're in, which is going to affect what they can charge. It's going to affect how they produce and what they produce. And it's so I totally agree with you. But I think it's a bit of a straw man. Adam Smith wrote 2 books. One's about how we interact with each other. That's the theory of moral sentiments when we're face to face. The other's the book about markets, which is the Wealth of Nations. They're both important. Couldn't agree more. And I couldn't agree more that Coase was a challenge to at least the textbook version, although I think he might have used a different word than the one you suggested when he was seeing the traditional theory. So I totally agree with you. It's the bottom line about a richer approach is very important. But I do think that it's important to think about the role of cooperation that occurs across space and across time that Prices allows, because we can't love everyone. We can't be face-to-face with everyone. As you say, we have a limited amount of time. We have a limited amount of resources, and it seems that Prices play a key role in allowing those things to be overcome a little bit. So let's move on.
So I would agree. I would agree 100%. And the only thing that I would say is that since that has been said, like Hayek said it, and, basically it gets regurgitated even nowadays in every comment section of every newspaper, more or less, when people are discussing the economy. Since the role of prices in revealing information about supply and demand had been said, I try to focus on aspects of information in the economy that had not been so much discussed in the literature, because I wanted to make a contribution, even if it's a little bit controversial, by bringing something that was a little bit different, which is the figuring out of what eventually you make and why the things that we make are the essence of what makes our economy prosperous, rather than just the commercial interactions that we have.
So let's move to that. You asked the following. You say, why is our ability to create refrigerators, jet engines, and memory devices concentrated in a few parts of the world? Why do many countries know how to make and export shoes, but only a few know how to make and export helicopters? So in that section of the book, you're trying to explain where what we might call what used to be called comparative advantage, sometimes I think confusingly called competitive advantage, but it's clearly an ongoing key part of our lives, the commercial part of our lives. What's your answer to those questions?
Yeah, so one thing that is a basic observation is that in some way our ability to produce products have what an ecology would call a geographic range. Yeah, there are certain parts of the world in which that ability exists, and there are other parts of the world in that ability does not exist. Okay, so from the perspective of the theory that I advance in why information grows, what determines the existence of that ability, first and foremost, is the knowledge and know-how that is embodied, in the networks of people that reside in a place. And that ultimately is what makes that knowledge very hard to transfer. Because let's say if you take Hollywood and you take all of the knowledge and know-how that is there about producing like blockbuster movies, that knowledge obviously is not stored in a single individual like James Cameron or Steven Spielberg, but it's stored in like large networks of people that get to collaborate, through markets and through social relationships to create, those films. And ultimately, there are very few parts of the world that can imitate that, because accumulated that knowledge is very hard, because you're going to have to accumulate it in a network because of the simple reason that it's too much knowledge to fit on a relatively small group of individuals. So going out from like a very Ricardian old theory of comparative advantage, in which there would be certain factors that a population is endowed with. Here the idea of the factors, which is a more modern way of looking at it, but that is also present in not only in my book but in other works in economics, is that these comparative advantages are much more dynamic because they hinge primarily on the computational capacity of social systems. And when you're looking at different countries or different regions or different cities producing different mix of products, what you are looking indirectly is at the knowledge and know-how that has been accumulated in the networks that populate those countries, cities, and regions.
Yeah, well, I like your contrast to Ricardian view, because if you weren't careful, you might think that the reason great movies come out of California is because they have mountains in the distance and lots of pollution. But then it would be easy to make movies in Santiago, Chile, where
exactly.
which I haven't been there since 1981, but it used to remind me a little bit of L.A. But as you point out, what makes Los Angeles extraordinary is the people, not the mountains, not the water, not the ocean, those help. Makes it pleasant for people to live there. But once they're there, there's an incredible power to those networks, and they're networks of people, not natural resources, nothing inherent about the geography.
Yeah. And those networks of people are just like the hardware where ability to make things needs to be embodied, because all of our knowledge, know-how always needs to be embodied, just like information needs to be physically embodied on DNA or photons or books or brains. Knowledge and know-how also needs to be embodied on people and networks of people. And, that's what, LA has, that's what San Francisco has, in the tech sector. That's what Boston has in robotics. That's what New York has in finance and, publishing. So these networks are ultimately, the hardware where we accumulate our capacity to make things, and are both, the enabler of our ability to create things that make our life prosperous, but also the curse of our inability of moving that knowledge and know-how around, because the knowledge is trapped in the networks that embody it.
So when you talk about transaction costs, we had a recent episode with Adam Davidson talking about the making of a Hollywood movie. And one of the things that struck him was that when you arrived on the set, nobody was bossing anybody around because everybody knew their job. There were 250 people who had done this many times before, and they just knew what had to get done. And what an incredible advantage that is in terms of transaction costs. It's an extraordinary, and coordination, an incredible thing. So then the question is, why is it that some countries excel at this coordination and trust and networking, and others struggle? And how do they, let's think about any lessons we might have for development and helping increase the standard of living in other places. It's obviously that you can't take a poor country and say, well, why don't you become really good at making movies? That way you'll be rich, because those are good paying jobs. And I think a lot of people make that mistake. But then the question is, okay, that doesn't work. What might work?
So the way that I see economies is as very historical systems, which is a little bit different than the more neoclassical ways of looking at economies that look them as ahistorical systems in which a set of incentives ultimately rules the system, and the system finds a configuration that matches those incentives and figures everything out. And the way that I see it is that they're very historical systems. So when you see an economy that has a capacity to produce a certain good, it's not that it was developed overnight through like some sort of incentive structure. It's that it was developed over a long period of time in which people accumulated in the context of a network all of the knowledge and know-how that they need to do that. So the way that I see the historical process is a way in which the mix of activities that you do actually helps shape a lot of important economic institutions. Recently, for instance, we finished a paper that we published as a working paper, and we're now sending to submission, in which we find a very strong correlation between the mix of products that a country makes and the income inequality that they have. And the way that I interpret that relationship is that in some way, the economic activities that a society performs has to shape the type of institutions that you have, because ultimately people don't learn, how to interact with others in sort of like the vacuum of their national identity, but they learn how to interact with others by going to work every day, and if you're going to work every day at a software firm in Silicon Valley where the structure is very flat and people is creative, but you have to basically be very direct, when it comes to feedback, you're going to have a different set of norms and expectations, and you're going to subscribe to a different set of institutions that if you're going every day to a mining operation in which the structure is very hierarchical, it's all around safety and it's top down, and basically contributing your creative input is something that is not encouraged. So as different countries have had historical different productive structures, these productive structures have helped shape the institutions that they have. These institutions obviously have helped shape the mix of products that they're able to make in the future. I think this is obviously a co-evolutionary process. And then eventually those structures can only adapt ever so slowly. And that's what we observe in the data. When we look at the data, we see that if you know the mix of products that a country makes and you try to make a machine learning algorithm or, that would predict what they're going to be making in 20 years from now, the predictions are very accurate because the fruit doesn't fall that far from the tree. Countries that are producing a certain mix of products usually end up being successful in the future at making products that are rather similar. And that tells you that there's a lot of things that go into a production of a product that can only be accumulated very slowly, and they can only be accumulated to things that are relatively similar to the ones that you already know.
So let me use an example from the book. A lot of manufacturing of the last 25 years has been done in China for the world. China's the world's factory. Somewhat less so maybe than it has in the past in terms of as an employer, because productivity is growing in the factories there just as they're growing everywhere, and that means fewer people are needed to make any level of production. But if you think about why that's true, and you give an answer, so give your answer to the book. Why did China become a centerpiece of industrial production, and as a result, improve their standard of living quite dramatically over the last 25 years? What do you think? How do you relate the concepts of your book to that story?
Yeah, so the way that I think about the particular case of China, which in some sense has been a little bit puzzling, we can say, is that on the one hand, when you think about institutions and the role that institutions have on shaping the capacity of an economy, I think institutions can act better as a brake than as an accelerator. So if you have a country that has a certain capacity, you can slow it down significantly, or you can even destroy that capacity through bad institutions, but you cannot jumpstart the development of those capacities very quickly by having good institutions. China is a country that historically has always been, very productive, creative, has a rich, history and has not been devoid of inventiveness or the generation of cumulative culture. And it had a very rough transition in the 20th century because China didn't go through a period of renaissance like Europe did, but moved more from a medieval society to a modern society over a period of only 100 years, maybe. But even if you go back to the 1950 and 1960, when China was the poorest country in the world, they had an elite, that had 80 million people, which is the size of the population of Germany, that was sophisticated enough to have been able to produce atomic bombs and to produce, relatively sophisticated things internally. So I think China is a country that in some way has had knowledge for a long period of time. It has a lot of capacity. And as the institutions became more inclusive of the exploitation of that knowledge and know-how in productive activities, China was a country that was seen to grow. But other countries are not in the same position because they might have the bad institutions that once they're removed, they're not liberating, a population that has accumulated a relatively good capacity to make things. So, for instance, when we look at our data, when we look at the economic complexity index, which is this formula that I created to estimate the computational capacity of a country, even if you go back to the 60s, China was above average in the world, despite being the poorest country in the world. So it's telling you that their ability to make things was never that bad, and that's why it's not that surprising that mainland China has followed the footsteps of other Chinese-based economies like Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore.
But it's interesting because so much of their productivity, it seems, is coming from the crystallized imagination of other people. A factory, an American corporation, an international corporation locating a factory in China versus somewhere else. Once they put it in China, those workers are suddenly very productive, but they're the same workers. They didn't literally get smarter. They don't have any more knowledge. They don't have any more know-how, but they're augmented by those machines. So they...
but if that were true, Ethiopia has 80 million people, Nigeria 100 million, we should be able to do that there as well. So I think the thinking that in China there was little capacity, I don't think so. Yeah,
I'm not sure. It's a good question.
Yeah.
That's your question for me. Why can't we? And my answer would be maybe we could if the governments and institutions of Nigeria and Ethiopia were a little bit more open to trust.
Yeah, so the way that I see it is that China is a country that has been relatively high in capacities, has had like a long tradition of history, arts, sciences, and that is different from that of Sub-Saharan Africa or Latin America in that case, and the story that people tell in the West is that China basically is like copying and imitating everything, and they get very little credit for what they're actually able to achieve. But in my view, and according to the data that I have, which is global data on international trade and production, China is a country that always has been relatively sophisticated in its ability to make things. It has actually increased over the last 40, 50 years, but not that much. It increased from like being, in the 40th number of the rank to being like 20th in the rank, that we have of economic complexity. And what explains for me the growth of China is not low prices, but the relatively low price of high capacity. Okay?
Agreed.
Because one thing is to be able to pay a person, $2,000 a year, and another thing is to be able to pay a person $2,000 a year when that person is able to produce something that is equivalent to what is being produced in a country that people are making $30,000 a year. Yeah.
I totally agree. I think the challenge is that an institution's problem? Is it a people problem? Is it a governance? Is it a private property rule of law problem? It's a lot of things going on there. But the part I totally agree with, you have a great sentence here. You say economic development is not the ability to buy, but the ability to make. And that's got to be that has to be the starting point. And I think that's very hard for people to accept.
Yeah. So I just published today a story on the Harvard Business Review that makes that point. And did you ever hear about Oswald the Lucky Rabbit?
No, I missed that. Tell me.
Yeah. So Oswald the Lucky Rabbit in the 1920s was more famous than Mickey Mouse. Okay? So he was a character that was developed by Disney and iWorks. Uwe iWorks was kind of like the Steve Wozniak of Disney being the Steve Jobs. Okay? He was actually the guy that made the drawings and was a great designer. And they created this Oswald the Lucky Rabbit character that became very popular in the 20s, but was owned by Universal Studios. So when Oswald became, very popular, Universal Studios threatened Disney to poach all of their animators if they didn't reduce their production costs. Okay? Why? Because basically Universal executives saw Oswald as what was valuable, what you had and what you could sell. What did Disney and iWorks did? On the train back from New York, they created a new character. That new character was Mickey Mouse. Okay? And obviously Mickey Mouse left Oswald the Lucky Rabbit on the dust relatively quickly, because ultimately what was valuable was not, what you had made, but your ability to make it, And time and time again, if you look at the history of firms and the history of creative activities, you'll find that the people that are doing creative activities, they get ripped off once, twice, 3 times, but they always are able to bounce back because you can take property away from someone, but you cannot take that tacit knowledge and know-how away from someone. And as long as that person has an ability to create something new, they're going to be able to create something better than what they did before because they're even more experienced and they learn from the bad experiences as well. So I completely subscribe to the idea that what is most valuable in economy is your capacity to make. It's not the book that you wrote, but your ability to write books. The film that you made, but your ability to create great movies.
Yeah, you can steal my book, but you can't steal my brain, right?
Exactly.
It's an important. It's a very important point. Actually, it sounds like a tautology or just a cliche, but it seems to me it is very important. A lot of your books about the augmenting of human potential with other people's crystallized information, other people's knowledge. Some people are very afraid of that because of what's coming with artificial intelligence. Where do you stand on that? What are your thoughts on what's going to be, quote, left for people to do after we figure out ways for robots to do everything?
Yeah, so I think that like some short-term and long-term views on that I think is important to discuss. And the question, if I read it correctly, it requires me to do a little bit of a value judgment. Yeah, because in some way it's a question that the answer is going to be good or bad, not yes or no. Yeah. So in that context, I have a very simple, moral axiom that I subscribe to, and I have very few of those. And in this case, is that you should never morally judge people from a different time period than yours because you're not prepared to do so. So, for instance, I wouldn't want a person from the 1500s to judge my lifestyle because probably they would find it deeply immoral, given the moral codes that they had at that time. I'm an atheist, I had sex before I got married. I did a lot of things that would be morally reprehensible according to the moral standards of the 1500s. By the same token, we might have grandchildren that are going to start plugging, USB ports into their brains directly, to augment themselves in ways that might feel scary to us. But personally, I think that that's like Puritans judging, people from San Francisco in the year 2015. We cannot make that moral judgment, and in that case, I have nothing but trust in that society knows better than I do. And that if that's the way that we're going to go, and that's the way that our economy is going to be in the future, in which we're going to embody ourselves in electrons rather than in, like complete carbon atoms like we do right now, that's something that I'm willing to let them decide, Yeah.
So you're an optimist, more or less. I think it's going to be okay.
I think that eventually we figure things out, and that doesn't mean that we find problems in between. But I'm a little bit of an optimist. I do think, for example, my friend Steven Pinker, he always tweets, that optimism that in some sense comes from like his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, that society, despite all of its problems, has been getting better. There is less violence now than it used to be. And obviously there's a lot of horrible things that still happen in the world. But all in all, as we move forward, we have been able to become better at many things. We're, for example, now much more environmentally conscious than we were 30, 40 years ago. That's the type of progress. Like Europe has had an extended period of peace, despite all of the economic problems that they might have had during the last decade. It has not, like the idea of a war between France and Germany, which was a recurrent thing, or a war between like Spain and England or whatever, that was a recurrent thing during history. It's not something that I would say it's in the horizon. So I do think that we figure out how to improve our society collectively, and that over the long timescales, the arc of time bends towards things that are positive. Because the things that are negative, they tend to be a little bit more transient, while the ones that are positive tend to grow more slowly, but be long-lasting.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm not sure I'm as optimistic as you are. I'd like to be, though. So I'll just say that. It could be true. What is next in the research on these kind of topics? We didn't get to talk about, we're almost out of time, and we didn't get to talk about the empirical side of this. You do a lot of interesting visualizations and measurement of complexity of economies, and I didn't fully understand them, and I'm looking forward to reading some more about them, and people can read about them in their book or in papers that you've written with colleagues. But even at the level of complexity that you're looking at, there's still a bit of a black box aspect of this, just as there is in the standard economic approaches. We don't really have a very good understanding of what's happening below the surface. And I suspect that's true of your computations as well. Do you want to try to make them more refined? Do you hope to? What do you see as coming next in terms of thinking about the growth of knowledge and information?
Yeah, so I would answer this with like two things that are now in my research agenda. On the one hand, definitely I want to develop better metrics of economic complexity that on the one hand might be more transparent and better theoretically founded, and on the other hand they are empirically even better at predicting the aspects of the economies that we have found these measures to be good at predicting, which is future economic growth, income inequality, and the mix of products that a country is going to be able to make next. On the other hand, one of the things that one of the areas that I've gone to during the last years is that I started to think about the world not only in terms of the mix of products that people make, but also in terms of the type of messages and cultural products that we produce. So a couple of years ago, we released a project that is similar to the Observatory of Economic Complexity, but that is called Pantheon, that looks at data from more than 11,000 biographies of globally famous people to try to map out how our collective memory has changed over time, because I become convinced that if we're going to go beyond, our understanding of economic growth that comes from thinking of measures of consumption like GDP, we have to look at our ability to compute and our ability to accumulate information. And we find very interesting things already in that new data set that focuses on the information that we have recorded in our history. For instance, we find that there are important discontinuous transitions in the rate at which we remember people that occur when you have changes in communication technologies. So we have a paper now that we're finishing in which, if you look at the period before the printing press, the 2,000 years preceding the printing press, and if you look at the number of globally famous biographies that we find in two comprehensive data sets, and you divide that by the population of the world at a given point in time, you find that the fraction of people that we remember is a constant number, is a constant fraction of the global population. So if you look at the number of people that we remember from the year 200 BC, it's the same fraction of the global population that the people that we remember from the year, 1200. Okay? That number didn't change. And when the printing press came along, that number jumped, and it became constant again for 300 years until you have, changes in the format of printing. There's the invention of journals, then eventually you have mechanized printing, communication technology, and then, our collective memory accelerates. We find also that who you remember has changed enormously as you change communication technologies. For instance, before, the invention of printing, most of the people in the biographical records that we have are either political leaders or religious leaders. They're kings, emperors, and prophets. After printing press, you have a new elite. History is not reserved to, the leaders of institutions anymore, but to this creative class that also includes artists and scientists. Then you have the introduction of, film and radio, and you generate an elite of performers that did not exist before. So one of the things that I've been interested in is to understand how our ability to record and process information changes over long periods of time. Because I do agree that GDP might have been growing only for the last 200 years or so, but our ability to process information has been growing for longer periods of time, even though it might have not been expressed in increases in GDP per capita.
My guest today has been Cesar Hidalgo. Cesar, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Okay.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.